Hey everyone, welcome to this presentation from CSWE 2021 called Open Textbooks, Educational Equity and Innovation. I'm Matt DiCarlo. Do you guys want to introduce yourselves?
I'm Susan Tyler, the University of Arkansas in Fayetteville. I'm a clinical assistant professor.
And I'm Whitney Payne, also a clinical assistant professor at the University of Arkansas in Fayetteville.
And I'm Rebecca Malden, an assistant professor at the University of Texas at Arlington.
Great. I'm at LaSalle University. So today we're going to be giving a quick introduction to open educational resources. We'll review some stuff about our open textbook projects and also some reflections that we had on our projects, some of the impacts that we've had on students. Unfortunately, we won't be doing a Q&A because this is a recorded presentation. So these were our results from when we were presented this live at CSWE. And I think most of the people inside of the audience felt that they were a little bit knowledgeable about OER. So for us, we are in another category. We are painfully knowledgeable about OER. We are all open textbook authors, which means that we have spent way too long knowing, doing, and learning about OER. So how does this match up with national figures? Pretty well. When you ask people whether they're aware of OER, most people have at least heard of it. But when you tack on something like Creative Commons, which is really crucial to understanding how open educational resources work, most people don't have a good idea about what OER is. How many faculty use OER? So this is from a study in 2021. And it's about a quarter of all faculty who teach introductory courses, and about 15% of all faculty use OER as a required material. So that's usually going to mean, instead of a commercial textbook, using an open educational resource, maybe from places like OpenStax or some of the ones that we've authored. And about 28% of faculty use OER as a supplementary resource. So we have a definition of OER that just basically has two components. One is access and participation. We'll sort of talk about what each of those components means. But some more formal definitions, OER are things like textbooks, videos, case studies, and data. They're just the same as other ones, except that they either reside in the public domain or they have an open license, like a Creative Commons license that permits people to access it at no cost and to use, adapt, and redistribute it freely or with very few restrictions. Open pedagogy is some of the pedagogy that sprouted up around the idea of open educational resources. So it's taking some of those ideas around access and trying to think about what are some of the other barriers to accessing the human right to education, and how do we sort of reconsider the educational resources that we use and create as part of a commons rather than something that is privatized. So the most core argument for OER is that students can't learn from textbooks they can't afford to purchase. It's very unlikely that commercial textbooks are actually worth what students end up paying for them. The only reason that they do end up paying so much is because they don't really have a lot of choice in the matter. Students aren't the people who choose what textbooks to order. Oftentimes that responsibility rests with faculty who get a free copy of the textbook and are insulated from some of those costs. I'm interested to hear from some of my co-panelists here. I just want to share that I would be in category H down here. I would be in the over $250 for this semester. Of the 4 courses that I'm teaching this semester, I believe the actual cost figure is like over $700. If you were to take all 4 of them. How about the rest of you guys?
Well, being that 2 of my courses, actually just one uses the OER, it's brought the cost down a little bit. But my other 3, I would also be in category H with those 3, because one course requires 3 texts. And so that right in itself, I think, puts me at the level H.
And I am going to flex a little bit here and say that I am probably right between C and D for all of my classes currently. And it depends. One of them is available as a free resource online as a PDF book, but not all of the students know that at the beginning of the semester and they buy the book anyway. It's a relatively cheap book. You can get it for probably $15, but it kind of depends on if the student finds it for free or if they purchase it.
So I would be D. I teach 2 courses. One of them is fully OER and one has 1 textbook.
Awesome. You guys are doing way better than I am. Come on. There we go. So how do students think about textbook costs? What are some of the predictable impacts? That the textbook costs are very, very high. They're due all at once at the beginning of the semester, that they add up from course to course, or as Susan talked about, having multiple required textbooks on the same syllabus for the same course, that at the beginning of the semester, this stuff is due all at once, that then competes with other needs like groceries, rent, and contributes to things like food insecurity and housing insecurity. And that it takes a lot of time to minimize textbook costs. Yes, it is often like fairly easy to get a textbook at a lower cost, but it takes time to do that. It takes more time for that textbook to come to you. It takes time for you to search from source to source and figure out whether you can get away with the last edition or a used edition versus a new one. And there's just not a lot of knowledge as to which textbooks will actually be used enough to justify their cost. And that a lot of faculty require textbooks that they don't use very much, and that students have had to pay for expensive textbooks before and don't want to get burned. But at the same time, there's a grade penalty, and it's sort of a balancing of those different risk factors is some of the stuff that we found in our study. So you can read the preprint on Social Archive if you're interested. So how do the high textbook costs impact social work students? And this is among a sample of social work students in Virginia. You have students who are taking on additional work hours and additional loans. Many of them violate copyright laws, whether that's accessing some of the shadow libraries online or just taking picture of their neighbor's phone. Generally speaking, our MSW students tended to do less of that, and our BSW students do more of it because they felt that once you're in your MSW program, you should be getting assigned textbooks and other resources that you will then use in the future. We had about a quarter of our students who said they didn't go visit family members over spring breaks and fall break or over winter and summer breaks just because of textbook costs, and that nearly a quarter skip a meal, and it certainly affects their opinions of higher education. One of the things that we found in our study that was a little bit different than the overall literature on textbook costs is that drop failure and withdrawal rates, persistence inside of academic degree programs, it wasn't really impacted by high textbook costs. We sort of theorized that some of the reason was that once you have declared a major, you're going to end up buying those textbooks no matter what, and you'll incur that financial penalty because you feel like you sort of have to do that to succeed. So what can happen when you redesign courses or even whole programs to just use an openly licensed resource? So the largest study to date is a study of over 20,000 students over 6 years. And this is at the University of Georgia. They switched 8 introductory courses to use an OpenStax openly licensed textbook. They saved students $3.2 million. Versus the cost of the previous textbook. And they also saw fewer drops, failures, and withdrawals, and that these gains were seen in particular among non-white students, Pell eligible students, and part-time students. According to different meta-analyses, when comparing open educational resources and open textbooks with commercial textbooks, they're about the same. In terms of the grades they produce, the test scores that they produce, but OER end up achieving those same outcomes at a lower cost. And one of the other things is that students tend to withdraw from those courses less, which helps with persistence over time. So those are some of the access arguments. It's basically around the human right to education and how paywalls and textbook costs can really get in the way of that. But it's also about participation, and that faculty and students and community members have to be equitable participants in creating and sharing knowledge. So if you think about the textbook that you currently use inside of your class, what are you able to do with that textbook versus an openly licensed textbook? Well, any textbook, you can teach from it. You can assign reading, summarize, quote, create some PowerPoints or some video lectures that you put on an LMS platform, but you can't do things like editing that textbook. Or like many of us did here, taking somebody else's openly licensed content, editing it thoroughly, customizing it to your own learning objectives and your own context, and resharing it. Those are things that you can't do. You can't publicly share a lot of the things that you do as a faculty member because of copyright. And building from open foundations and using open textbooks allows you to do things like put a free copy on an LMS platform or email it to a student. So interested to hear from some of you all. For the stuff that you created to teach your classes this year, how much can you legally share without violating copyright laws? I can't share very much.
Well, my course, as you guys will hear, is all about creating OER. So I would say all of what I've created is shareable.
Now, this one I can't flex on, especially right now, because I'm not teaching HIBSE 2, which is where my OER textbook comes from. And so I don't know. I'm like, I probably can't share anything, very little in my addiction courses.
Yeah, with my HIBSE 1 course, my OER course, I can share all of it. But with my other courses, I don't think there's much except for maybe some videos, again, that are on some open platforms where I've, YouTube, things like that, gotten them from. But other than that, no, it's all connected to the text.
Yeah, definitely. I think one of the challenging things, and one of the things that I really like about open education, is very similar to the way that I was taught, like when I was like first teaching, which is like, go to the person who taught it previously, they'll share everything that they have with you, and you can sort of borrow from it and take from it and adapt from it. And it's just a way of sort of scaling that up. Copyright really gets in the way of us sharing our work with each other, and building from open foundations, creating your own open textbook or adopting and building resources from it means that the things that you create, those derivative and adapted resources, can be shared broadly. So think about what platform you are putting some of your content on. Think about who owns the information that you are using. Why are we putting our stuff on platforms that are inaccessible to the public and that students will lose access to at the end of the semester? That where adapted and derivative content can only be shared informally with your close circle of colleagues, and not something that you can put and archive on the internet. And that ultimately this leads to a privatization of social work knowledge and suppresses participation with students and communities in the process of creating and sharing scholarly knowledge. So some of the cool stuff you can do with OER are things like creating OER with students. These are two examples of social work open textbooks that were a project inside of a classroom. This first one is a family studies course. It's intended at sort of the sophomore or junior level. And the one on the right is a guidebook that's written by students for how to do human service internships and field placements, which is really cool. But we also have Rebecca's project, which is really interesting. And her students prepared this short video, which I'm going to play for you now.
Hello, everyone. We are first-year PhD students. I am Fahim.
And I'm Megan.
We are PhD students at University of Texas at Arlington. Go Mavs!
Yes.
So we, in our class, are discussing the Carlo book and comparing it to other commercial textbooks.
And why we're doing that is we're trying to update the DiCarlo textbook from an MSW level to a PhD level. And so this is part of something called open education. And so we are working together as a class to update the textbook. And so we're reviewing the text independently. We're doing something called a flipped classroom, where we're watching things at home, we're watching videos, we're learning, we're reading the textbook, and then we come together. Each week we pick one of us to be the leaders, and we go through and update the text. One thing we really enjoy about this is the fact that we're creating a renewable resource. So rather than just writing up a paper that at the end of the semester you throw away and never look at again, Instead, we're creating something that will be used by future students. And so it feels much more meaningful. It's an awesome opportunity to put our knowledge into practice and to build up our publications and CVs.
Being the first year PhD student and a working mom, open educational resources have been just such a great tool for me, being that it's accessible. I'm able to download the material onto my phone. I'm able to listen to it on the go, and it has just been an excellent way for me to ensure that I'm staying caught up on my materials for classes.
As an international student, money can often be tight, especially when it comes to spending $500 on textbooks every year. Open educational resources has really helped me overcome that barrier, and it also makes classrooms really equitable.
And we invite you all, professors, teachers, researchers, scholars, to bring this into your classrooms and discuss it with your students. Because when we graduate, we're going to use this in our classrooms with our students when we teach them. OER is a perfect opportunity to teach and learn and use these resources.
It's an honor to be trusted with the ability to impact future scholars.
You know, when we first got this assignment, I think we were really intimidated by it. You know, it was like our first few weeks of being in a PhD program and our professors telling us that we're going to update a textbook that's been written by people with their PhDs who are working, who are professionals, who are esteemed in the world of academia. So we weren't sure that we were going to be able to contribute. But what we kind of learned through this process is that we do have expertise. We have things we can pull on from our practice experience or from the other classes that we've been taking, or even we can just say, this didn't make sense to me. And as a student, I want to know how can we do this better? And so something that's really cool about the OER process is it gives the power back to the people who are most likely to be impacted. So rather than the power being with the publishers or, you know, authors who have been in the field for decades and decades and decades, even though they have valuable expertise, it's kind of cool that this gives the power back to the people who are actually using the text and to us, the ones who are trying to learn. And so we've learned a lot, we've grown a lot, and I'm going to pass it to Letitia to talk about some other things we've really enjoyed.
Absolutely. How Megan shared, we're the experts of our story. The best thing about OER and its process is that the stories that are happening right now are being put in text form. It's a great opportunity to be learning in action. A great way for scholars, students, clinicians in the field to be able to read what other people are doing. So not only can we impact those that we serve now, but those that will be served in the future.
All right, some other things that you guys can do with open educational resources are things like localizing resources. So the example on the right here is from a Principles of Microeconomics textbook that has been localized to Hawaii. So all of the examples there are going to relate to things to specific to that state. Also working with peoples whose perspectives have been traditionally excluded from the social work canon and our sense of what is valid science. There is a big movement inside of open textbooks to build that equity into the process itself. Also, collaboration with practitioners as well. So let's get into a little bit of our open textbook projects. We'll start with Susan.
Okay. So my project is Human Behavior in the Social Environment 1. There's 2 sections of our HPSI 1 course, and we see approximately 30 students in each section, so about 120 students a year. And looking at money saved from what the text we were using is a savings of a little over $4,000 a year for our students. Right now, I'm working to implement an adoption survey to identify the numbers of adoptions and remixes so I can see who's using, where it's being utilized at, and hopefully gather some nice information related to that that'll help me work on making any adjustments in the future.
Awesome. I'm adopting your book for next semester, so that's great. All right, Whitney.
Okay, so this is the textbook for Human Behavior in the Social Environment 2. And pretty much, you know, it aligns with what Susan was talking about, because the students that go through her HIBSE 1 course go through my HIBSE 2 course. So my numbers down at the bottom are not accurate. It's more around 120 students a year. Thinking about moving forward, I want to do something similar to track adoptions. But one of the things I've realized is I spent so much time putting it together and getting it ready and publishing it, that now so much time has passed that it's really a good time to revise some of the content. Lots of things have changed. We've been given some feedback about incorporating information about the pandemic into the textbook and the impact that it has had. And so the hope is that I will start revising the ancillaries and the content in the spring semester of 2022.
Awesome. Oh, I have similar plans. I always give myself way too ambitious deadlines though. So I'm Matt. These are the two open textbooks that I have adapted or created. The one on the left is the MSW textbook. The one on the right is intended for BSW students, although they're both used at both levels. So currently I'm working on a second edition of the BSW textbook that has been delayed quite a bit because the production timeline for the MSW textbook went way over. And I didn't even get to finish visual design before I had to hit publish at the end of the summer. So I need to go back and do that next summer, hopefully. So far, the BSW textbook has been pretty popular. It has been adopted by over 70 faculty in comparison to the commercial textbook that used to be used in those courses. We saved students over $300,000. The MSW textbook is currently over 9 faculty. I've gotten a couple of emails, but not sure who confirmed as yes or no. But yeah, our savings are around $11,000 so far, and that's just within the first couple of months after publication.
So this is the initial project that I had a couple of years ago. And basically, I took Matt's book, the scientific inquiry book that had been written at the BSW level, and adapted it so that we could use it in both our MSW and our PhD programs. And we actually split it out into 2 separate books. So the one book is basically just a guidebook for anyone who wants some help on doing lit reviews and writing research proposals. So it's a standalone material, and Matt and I are co-authors on that. Then the second book was adapted. One of the things that we needed was to take that BSW book and make it a little bit more challenging in some places so that it could also be used in the MSW program. So some of what we did was just add material, refine material, and then we got to do the really cool piece of localization. So in most of the chapters, there's this little segment that says Spotlight on UT Arlington. And someone who was on faculty in our school wrote a little piece about, what about my research in terms of sampling, or my research in terms of measurement, or whatever that chapter was about. And we've gotten some super feedback from students about how being able to do this, read this book, makes them feel so much more connected to the school and to the university. So that's been really great to hear. One thing I will point out is that because we're a fairly large school and we do this across our MSW and our BSW programs, we're saving like $63,000 a year for our students by using these textbooks. But by the project that you saw, the other students who did the video, there were 4 students on the video, but there's actually 6 students in that course. And generally, a lot of times that the funding or the emphasis on creating OER text is for these big courses where you're making a big splash, a big impact across multiple courses, multiple sections. And it's much harder to find OER for courses that have smaller impact and smaller audiences. So the fact that I'm able to be creative, so the project that you saw, I think you probably picked that up, that's PhD students are taking Matt's book that he wrote, and he and his colleagues wrote at the MSW level, And we're rewriting it so that it becomes a PhD level social work research methods textbook. And there's 6 students. And obviously the number of PhD students across the country is not going to be anywhere close to the number of PhD students across the country. But they still have the same needs in terms of accessibility. They still have the same desires for access, even if it's just, what the one student was saying about listening to it on their phone. And so I think it's important to have people who are willing to engage in the service and the grunt work that it takes to create materials for some of these smaller courses as well. That's it.
I totally forgot that about your book. It's so cool. That's such a good idea. All right. So speaking of which, I don't know, how'd you guys plan your open textbook project? What was that like?
Well, mine came about, as I started teaching, I went to a lunch and learn a few years ago, and their topic was open educational resources. And it brought me back again to the time when I was in school and having to buy all my books, and it just made sense to try to connect to it in some way, shape, or form. So I started talking with Whitney, since she teaches the second part of HIBC. And we had talked a little bit about some of the issues with evaluations of students saying that they felt like there was a lot of repetition between the 2 courses. So we were already in talks of working to figure out how we could kind of structure and separate and make the courses a little bit more focused on, I think, on what they should have been. Again, using traditional texts, you cover a lot of the same things as you go on to the second section of courses. And so I think this really helped alleviate a lot of that. And yeah, so that kind of is how I got started into it, and slowly like roped Whitney into it with me. And I'll let her share kind of what that was like on her end. But it just kind of seemed to make sense.
Yeah, and I think Susan covered it really well, and that in my class in particular, I had a textbook that was full of good information. I never want to come across as being overly critical of the textbook because it's a good quality textbook, but it was dry, it was expensive, it was really difficult for students to connect to. Most students admitted by the end of the semester that they weren't reading it at all. I read it. I inherited it when I inherited the class, and it was like difficult for me to read, and like half my job is reading stuff like that. So I was like, this is a lot. And so I had been in the market for a new book, but everything that Susan and I kept getting was in like exorbitantly expensive. It was even more expensive than the existing textbooks we had. And there was a lot of overlap in the information in the textbooks. And so Susan had gone to this lunch and learned about OER, and she told me about it, and I was like, what in the heck is this? So I went to the same lunch, and then we set up a meeting, and our OER representative in our library is like a magician or like a hypnotist or something. I don't know what happened, but by the time we left that meeting, we were like, we're applying for the grant, and this is a great idea. And I've struggled with that since then. I'm glad we did it, but there were moments in time where I was like, what did we do? But yeah, that was kind of what got us started, was not a lot of good options, really expensive. And I think I mentioned this at CSWE, HIBC 1 and 2 those are not books you're going to keep. They're not practical, they're not relevant to practice. And so why would you have your student pay $150 for this book that is not going to be something they're going to want to keep and use later? So
I'm glad you brought up grant applications, because for me, that was the most planning I put into both of my projects, was writing the grant application. And my initial thought on how did I plan was like, oh my God, I didn't even plan. I just jumped right in, and it's just all of a sudden just going crazy trying to figure out what to do and doing it, real time or whatnot. But many of our projects have been funded. And I think that process of going through a grant application and creating the timeline for the grant application and thinking about your budget and all of those things are really, for me, were really critical. That was, once I got started with it, there was no time to think about what I was doing and getting organized. It was just going crazy doing things. So to have some time carved out where you're forced to sort of plan, I think was really helpful for me.
Yeah, doing the grant application is definitely where it started to feel real for me. I think planning for me was definitely centered around the summer, just because that's the most time that we have. I think, I was very like way overly ambitious with stuff, which is fine when it's like a solo project, because really you're just inconveniencing yourself. And if you push your own deadline, that's not too bad. But if you are doing a collaborative piece, then things are going in the order that they wanted to, and things can really compound. And I think that was one of the things that, while all of my collaborators were like really patient with all of that, like we were way late. We blew through so many deadlines, and we ended up losing some peer reviewers just because they sort of lost touch with the project. And yeah, that's sort of how it goes. All right, let's see, what supports did you all rely on for your textbook project? Somebody want to take that one first?
Okay. For me, I know it was a lot of our OER coordinator at our library. She, like Whitney said, I don't know what happened when we were with her, but all of a sudden, like, this project was happening. And she was fantastic in answering our questions, helping support us. We were in the midst of it when COVID hit and everything kind of shut down, which I think maybe did help a little bit in the end with allowing us more time. And I think a little more grace, as everyone was like, what's happening? And nobody knew what was going on. But she was a huge part for me. And then our GA did a lot of the background work. I know Whitney and I share a GA. And so she was working on both our projects at the same time, and bless her heart, she did such a great job. But again, being able to sit work on those pieces and then hand it to her and have her build it for us in Pressbooks was huge. That was a huge part of it, especially because I'm not super technological. And so she was able to take it and do her magic and get it all put in and then send it to us for editing and things like that.
When I was gonna say, like, timelines, ours would have been more like yours, Matt, if we hadn't had our GA like literally build our textbook in Pressbooks. And then our next GA was the one who went through and edited all of my ancillary materials and was able to check on copyrights for my images and my video links and put references into all the slides. And I didn't even know, like, PowerPoint templates are like copyright protected. And so we had to even change that, like what we could use. And so I couldn't have done it without GAs and Elaine over at the library with OER, and like so much coffee, just so much caffeine. I would go to our public library and sit in their lobby. This was pre-COVID, and I would drink like a 7-shot Americano or whatever, and just like just hammer this OER stuff out in the summer. I'd be like, I've got to go to the library for 9 hours and try to get this done. It was, I'm sure, a sight to see when I was there, because I'd have Post-it notes everywhere. And but yeah, those were that. And commiserating with Susan, having somebody to commiserate with, because we're the only ones in the department who have done anything with OER. So that was really nice too.
Absolutely. Having a buddy to go through the process with you, I think was, yeah. Grace maybe in it.
I don't want to be too repetitive, but I'd just be remiss if I didn't say the library OER staff there, the OER coordinator, was just amazing. Also colleagues, without a doubt. For us at our university, this is a provost level initiative. They really care a lot about OER. So it just made me more comfortable being tenure track, thinking, well, I'm not going to be doing as much research if I'm spending time on OER. So I felt as if, we'll see when I go up, but I felt as if there was some support institutionally for the concept of OER. Students, the GRAs who worked on the project were amazing. And then the other thing, I just had a lot of departmental support, and it was so necessary. So letters of support for getting the grant. Even just yesterday, seriously, the funding comes from the university through the library, and they require surveys for every student who's in a class where OER is used for like the next however many decades. I mean, it seems like in perpetuity, basically. And I'm not teaching that course anymore. And so I don't really have a lot of ability to administer the survey. So even just being able to reach back up to academic affairs admin and say, please get this survey out and have them do that. And last but not least, I did this in my first year, and I didn't quite understand all the committee procedures to changing a required text in a course. And so we had some funding requirements that were like, you have to adopt this book on such and such a date. That's your firm deadline. And I didn't take it to committee to be voted on for a change. And then I like realized this probably the 2 days after the last committee meeting of the semester, and everybody jumped in, pitched in, got it through, pushed it through, got the faculty vote, and we were able to change that. So just having the departmental support was amazing too.
Yeah, I would definitely echo that as well. Like just having people, we have fewer supports at Radford, which was my previous institution where I wrote the majority of both of these books. But we did have a lot of institutional buy-in and state level action, but not necessarily as it's like we don't have an OER publishing program. Those books are both published either at other institutions or just on pressbooks.com. The other bits that I wanted to point out, if you don't have OER people at your school, there are other OER resources out there. The Open Education Network, the Rebus community, there are a ton of office hours and drop-in places. OER people are fairly visible. You can also check out the OER, the Open Ed Conference, which is a free conference after it actually happens. So, yeah. All right, let me let our slides back up. What barriers did you all hit with your open textbook projects?
For me, I think the biggest was just the time and not realizing how much time it was actually going to take. Whitney and I did not plan to end up with textbooks when we started this project. And so it kind of morphed into another beast in the midst of working on it. And again, I just didn't realize what all it would entail. So the time frame really stretched. And again, COVID hit during that time. So it kind of threw everything out of whack. But again, I don't know if that was so terrible now that I look back on it, because it did again allow, I think, some more time to open up. Having the summer to work on majority of it, kind of like you spoke about, Matt, like the semester gets busy. And, when we first started, luckily it was just little bits of things we had to get done. And then once summer hit is, I think, when Elaine started talking about, why don't you just put all this together? You're right here, just take one more step. And it was like, oh, okay, why not? And then I think that's for me really when I was like, what did we do? What happened here? But again, having the time, I think, is the biggest thing, is recognizing if you want to step into this, you're going to have to set aside and know it's going to take up a good chunk of time. So making sure you do plan for that.
Yeah,
I can
oh, go ahead, Rebecca.
No, you go.
I got like used to our round robin or whatever. But no, time was big, but competing priorities for me really stands out, because other things had to be prioritized. And so OER would take, the back burner, and then you'd have to come back to it. And then, and filling up your break times with trying to get it all together and get it all organized, and it evolving over time. And I was reflecting back, and did we start this in the spring of 2019, Susan? Or was it in 2018?
I think in the fall of 2018 is when we went to Lunch and Learn and the idea started, but I think we actually
Yeah,
working spring of 19. And our plan
okay.
and run it in the spring of 2020 and let it go its full thing and that in the way we wanted it all. So it did
And
push.
that was the thing. It was just kind of, and it was nebulous. Like, that's what I mean. I can't even remember, but I also had like a new baby at the time. And I remember there were so many personal and professional competing priorities that I was like, I don't know what I'm doing. So, but then it started to come together. And like you said, the pandemic, I think allowed us to have a lot more grace in our timeline. And that was helpful.
For me, I mean, absolutely time and competing priorities. I couldn't agree with you more. But some additional things, I think some of the barriers are my limits of my own imagination, because really the sky's the limit with this. And so sometimes I look back and I'm like, oh, I could have done that and I could have done that. So just, there are limits to how creative you are in a time crunch. And I think I do see that as a barrier to the greatness. The fabulous thing is you can always change it, and you can change it in no time. We are really lucky at UT Arlington to have our own open publishing group. I think it's called Open Maths Press. And that was not really a barrier, but what was a barrier was my learning curve about how to work with them. Things that I didn't know would be policies, or my first project, and then there was changes in the way things were operated in the publication side of things to the next. So I would just say learning curve, like learning if there's any internal policies with your publication organization, and learning about OER. I mean, I started both projects really from, bare minimal knowledge, and I had to ramp up really fast.
Yeah, definitely. Even though we didn't have an OER librarian in our school, I definitely annoyed a number of them in order to actually get it done. I think some of the other supports that I found, or some of the other barriers that I found important, were this thing called juniority, which we've sort of, it's the opposite of seniority. It's a problem, I think. So right after I and my colleagues wrote the MSW textbook, none of us taught from it for the following year. So we weren't able to dedicate time to creating ancillary resources or editing the textbook or doing any of the things that we were doing, because we were all prepping for other classes. And that sustainability for our open textbook projects, when you don't control the courses that you were teaching, often means that you are doing other people's course prep for them. Or at least helping by revising these online resources. And that sort of mismatch can be really challenging. All right, impact on student learning. Whitney, I believe you're first.
So Susan and I did administer a survey, I think for 3 semesters. We started administering it when we were just using links from open sources, so pre-textbook, and then we continued through the first semester of actually having a formal textbook in both classes. The survey was for both mine and Susan's class. In the survey, they had to identify whether they were in HIBSE 1 or HIBSE 2, but again, learning curve with survey development, so all of the feedback was mushed together. So if we were to go back and do it again, we'd probably figure out a better way to separate it. But, I put some samples of survey responses on this slide. The biggest things we heard were, it's free, it's financially accessible, which was huge. The students were more likely to read it because it was concise. We were able to make chapters shorter. You're able to build in more interactive materials into the press books, and the ancillaries are available there as well. It was kind of funny. One student response I got was like, it's not heavy. Like I don't have to haul this heavy textbook around campus all day long, which I don't know if Matt or Rebecca, you've ever been to the University of Arkansas in Fayetteville, but it doesn't matter. This place is weird. It's like Harry Potter. It's like, no matter what direction you're coming from, it's uphill. Like there is no downhill. It's all a hill. And so this is, and it's a sprawling campus. So you have to walk everywhere. And so students talked a lot about that. And it's accessible on multiple platforms and they can print it off. So it's easy. They can read it on their phone or on their tablet or on their laptop. They can print it out if they prefer to have it that way. And I think we've only had a couple of students who have said they just prefer a more traditional textbook, but overall, I think students have been very happy about the change.
Yeah, I'm just going to kind of add on to what Whitney said. I just have some quotes of feedbacks too. I hadn't really thought about the heaviness of the books. I'd forgotten about that walking across campus until I saw the feedback and was like, that's right. I remember that too. But yeah, very small percent preferring that traditional text. And I think with the way everything is moving, it just makes sense that things are online and accessible, because I think that's how most of our students do access most of their information now. And so it's been very positive overall. I think, again, the most negative was the ones that just preferred that traditional text. Some had some issues with just formatting. Like I know I used vignettes in mine, and some said, they preferred having some text before the vignettes hit because it's vignette and then I go in to talk about it. So little things like that. But again, as Rebecca pointed out, we can always go in and edit and make changes given the feedback that we're receiving. And that's one thing I do appreciate about this so much, is I feel like I can actually do something with the feedback that we're given versus going, my hands are kind of tied. I can't do anything about that unless I just change around like all my assignments or kind of my expectations and things like that. So I think it's been super positive overall.
Yeah, I would echo all of those things. Those are definitely things that I found, like just on the actual physical quality of the text, but there are definitely students who prefer print and things like that. One of the weird things that we got from some of the focus groups that we ran is that students' copies of Reuben and Babby fell apart. Like the actual like $200 textbook, like if you opened it all the way in the first chapter, the binding just splits. Mine did too. And like, so literally this thing that was printed by a workbook company and that was shipped to their house in like home binding was better quality than the $200 textbook they ended up paying for. Anyway, I'm here to tell you that your studies probably won't reveal a lot of difference. Your experiment of 50 people, probably the quantitative outcomes, while they are helpful, especially cost savings, you want to make sure that the grades are at least roughly equivalent, but really it's the qualitative data that helps us really understand what impact is happening. And it's unlikely that a change in textbook between one that's pretty good and worthy of being in your class to another one that's pretty good and worthy of being in your class is going to create big enough changes for you to detect. However, it might change the student learning experience enough where you might get students who are more engaged. Some of the cool stuff that we found is that by customizing and personalizing the book, I often felt like I was translating like really difficult passages in the book for students. I was just able to do that right away. And that is something for as somebody who creates an open textbook, it's great for me, but for adopters, they would need to go in and then do that themselves, or else they're making do with examples from my life. That when we had a multi-site study with a lot of different professors implementing books, their use varied. We had easy professors who gave easy A's who used only their own worksheets, but would have otherwise required this $200 textbook that they would have never used. And in that case, OER was really a peripheral part of that course, but ended up saving students $200 a piece. Versus like classes that I run, which use the textbook a lot, like all of the assignments are interlinked with the book, and just because that's how I'd prefer to teach it. We also found that hybrid students, because they because they aren't on campus enough or as much, they have to rely on that textbook as sort of their core learning thing. So, you know, if you don't understand the textbook and your professor goes over most of the important stuff in a slideshow, that really works for many students if the textbook is hard to understand. But if the textbook is hard to understand, you only see your professor once every other week or so, it's much more difficult to catch back up on some of those concepts. That, you know, we had a lot of students in our hybrid part-time program who were non-traditional students, students who were older, and students who had lacked a statistics class in undergrad. And so they were really, a lot of the commercial books really assumed a level of knowledge that students didn't have, and they needed way more introductory to research, how do you do a lit review kind of stuff, versus most commercial textbooks, which just sort of start with a lot of assumed knowledge. And that we saw, not with everybody, but that research attitudes improved. One of my favorite quotes from the focus groups was that we had a student who said that this was their favorite book and then immediately felt bad that their favorite book was about research. Because they're just like, yeah, that sucks. And because they don't like research, but you know, that's a pretty low bar to clear. And I think OER really helped with that because it made it less stilted and more embodied. Like they were able to see, like, in confidence intervals, how that applies to things like my kids being bored and the due dates that were given and things like that. So yeah, our hybrid and non-traditional students were definitely the most helped. So how do you get started with OER? I would recommend by starting and looking at the OER starter kit. So you can find open textbooks to adopt at Open Social Work, which is the collaborative website that I run. We scan stuff from the Open Textbook Library, which is run out of the University of Minnesota, the Pressbooks Directory, which is a nonprofit that I think all of our projects run in Pressbooks. Pressbooks is a textbook delivery platform. Other ones that you might see are things like Manifold or Overleaf, but we all use Pressbooks. OER Commons and Merlot do have authoring tools. There's a really cool BSW communication skills video toolkit in Merlot. There's a great intro to social work textbook inside of OER Commons. So they do have authoring platforms, but most of the things you're going to find there are like smaller resources like videos, case studies, you know, not whole textbooks. How do you adopt an open textbook? The same way you adopt a normal textbook with some other things attached to it. So definitely review how to download a textbook, how to access a website that is a textbook, how to annotate any of those things and comment and highlight, how to print it out. Definitely put those links in the LMS, the email, and the syllabus. If they are not there, if you're not going over that on the first class, hey, this is the textbook, this is where you access it. You have to build those access patterns early or else students aren't going to get it. I definitely had students who paid the $50 for the bookstore's printed edition of this book rather than accessing the free edition because they're just so used to purchasing the stuff from the bookstore. And yeah, and for that reason, it's important to clarify the information in the bookstore library. Most like Follett and Barnes & Noble campuses have an OER option where it at least tells students, hopefully, that they don't have to buy this $50 print edition. They can just access it for free or talk to your professor about how to access it. So we've gone over a lot of the benefits of open textbooks. Why don't faculty do it? Because it's difficult to find what they need. Open textbooks are in a lot of different places. They're published at a lot of different universities. A lot of times they also feel that there's a lack of resources for my subject. I'm so sorry, I don't remember who brought this up, but we talked about a lot of the times there are a lot of resources for general education classes and large high enrollment classes. I think it was Rebecca. And as you get sort of further out the curriculum, there are fewer and fewer resources out there. They have concerns about updates. As we all talked about, updates are things that we are all very interested in, but aren't necessarily incentivized, and we have a lot of competing demands. That there's concern that OER are free and therefore not high quality. If it were high quality, it would be associated with a commercial publisher and it would cost more money. And that there are questions on permissions and use because Creative Commons and is not something that people are really used to working with. On the other hand, like, people are usually satisfied with the textbooks that they adopt. If you find an open textbook and you like it, that's really the test. No one can tell you an open textbook is going to be better than the textbook that you were using. You're the only person who can really do that. But if you find one, there are some benefits to using it. And we tried to make a lot of those challenges that we went over on the last slide a little bit easier. If you go to opensocialwork.org/textbooks, there are, I believe, 68 Open textbooks from across the social work curriculum. We just updated that, and we also pulled in over 100 open access books. So just like you can pay an article processing charge at a commercial journal and make your stuff open access, you can do the same thing with commercial publishers and your books. And there are a ton of open access books out there for social workers. You can also hook up to our quarterly newsletter and yeah, chat about some new textbooks and open projects. And this is a collaboration, Open Social Work, with Kim Pendell from Portland State. But let's say you want to go dive even deeper. If we haven't scared you away from this project by our presentation, obviously you search and find stuff to build from. Hopefully you've adopted this textbook at this point. Consult a librarian. Learn Creative Commons. It's not super hard, but there are some intricacies to it, and it's always good to have an authoritative copyright person who can tell you what's wrong and what's right. Access an editable file for the open resources you adapt. So if there's a Pressbooks project, ask the person for the Pressbooks XML. If it's in Microsoft Word, or you can copy and paste stuff, but the more you do that, the more manual work there is. So if you can get access to an editable file, that would be great. Personalize and customize that thing, change it based on your own learning objectives, how you teach, what examples you have, your personal experience, the things that are relevant to you, so that when you're teaching that class, they get your version of what they need to learn the first time they sit down to learn it. Pilot test and revise it. I know that that was really helpful for me. I ended up creating a resource just in Microsoft Word and sharing it with a small group of students. They gave me a ton of feedback, and we ended up then publishing the resulting thing in Pressbooks. And yeah, publish on an open platform. Your OER stuff is really great, but unless you actually share it with other people, not everybody's going to benefit from it. So put your stuff on the Open Textbook Library, put your stuff on OER Commons and Merlot, share it on the BPD listserv, share it on social media, and make sure that other people can see it. You're going to want to measure your adoption. So starting that adoption survey and making sure that when somebody adopts your book, there's a little thing in the front for faculty members and say, hey, if you adopt my book, please let me know. And it really helps with the sustainability of projects over time, because you're going to have to find all of those grammar errors that you didn't get time to fix. Speaking it for myself. Or people are going to ask you, how do I adopt this book? Can I have other resources? You should be there needs to be a plan in place for some of that stuff. So yeah, I guess in closing, we have a lot of motivations for engaging in open textbook projects. Thank you all very much for watching. Bye.